Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for the latest episode of Missions Talk. I'm Mike Falkenstine here at 1A Catalyst, and I'm here again with two friends. So Steve Schirmer, who is my co-host and friend, and Steve, we have an exciting show today, don't we? We're going to talk about refugees again. I know we've done a show about this before, but with some of the things that have just happened over the last year, even, this has become in the forefront again, and I think a real ministry opportunity. So, Steve, I know you have a heart for this topic as well, don't you?
Absolutely. So when the Afghan crisis, or when the U.S. military pulled out, of course, we were all watching the news, watching the crisis unfold, the videos at the airport, at the Kabul airport, the events after that. Our ministry got involved. It's not even something we were looking to do this year, but a phone call from a friend led me to connecting with a group of people that are actively trying to evacuate Afghans. They're still actively trying, working, and successfully in many cases. And in fact, we just had an Afghan family arrive here where we live by helping a neighbor's son of mine, Afghans he knew when he was in the military, get out. So yeah, it's just, I've seen a lot of people resonate for different reasons than maybe 10 years ago when the Syrian crisis hit. So it's been good to see people respond. In fact, I had a conversation yesterday with a professor down in South Texas about the Afghans in San Antonio coming in, wanting to get his students involved overseas. So yeah, there's a lot of movement, at least for the time being. So wanted to capitalize on that and really talk about this. So Jason Lee's a friend of mine. He used to live up here in the upstate of South Carolina. He was a pastor here, and then he was hired by World Relief at the time when they started the offices here in the upstate. So this area became a refugee resettlement center. Since then, he's relocated back to Georgia. I learned then that he's actually from Georgia. I think I've got that correct, where he's at now. And now he's leading a ministry in an effort called the Acts17 Initiative. So if I misspoke it, just correct me, Jason. Hey, Hey, I think Mike needs to get a beard.
Yeah. He lives in Colorado. Mike, I'm coming to see you someday, and I don't know how you're going to brave these harsh Colorado winters.
That's right.
I think he's got the facial hair for it. It looks like he could grow one.
I could, but.
So anyways, Jason, we've spoken with you before. We've interviewed you in the past,
yeah.
So thank you for coming back. And definitely with the Afghans coming into the U.S., we thought we would tap into you and just hear what's going on with you, the Acts17 initiative, things you're doing related to refugees. So anyways, why don't you just fill in the gaps where we missed about you?
Sure.
And then we'll get into some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Steve and Mike. It's great to be with you guys. Steve's become a dear brother just in the few years we got to know each other together in the upstate, and getting to meet Mike through Steve. Grateful for you brothers and to be with you. So really briefly, I was born and raised in West Metro Atlanta, and then left in 2000, and after getting a variety of opportunities in college and post-college to do global missions, and then going to seminary, and then a year later spending a year in East Africa, primarily in northern Kenya. And so I was there in 2001, and there when 9/11 happened, and that was my first real interaction with refugees. I was working with a recently more reached group called the Samaru people when 9/11 happened, and there was 10 or 15% of the population in that area where I was were Somali, refugees, and of course not. It wasn't a formal refugee resettlement process in northern Kenya, but some of my Samaru friends said, "Hey, you can help. We'll protect you from the Muslim Somalis coming here, so Bin Laden or they won't get you." And so it was my first very small interaction of recognizing what refugees might deal with in terms of fear. Refugees, are facing fear of persecution and fleeing from that.
Mm-hmm.
Though I was secure, the mission agency would help take care of me in those things. It was a different world in 2001, as we all know. And then upon returning and got married in 2002, my wife had served in North Africa, and we, in God's providence, she was really worried she was going to lose her Arabic when we moved to Louisville, and God had different plans. A couple weeks in, we met some Somali refugees where we'd go in their homes. She began to use her Arabic. I just looked dumb because I knew no Arabic outside of your basics, but could drink chai and could talk to folks. And she began to use her language skills. They began to host us, and I began to just help them do life, help them understand how to get a car and how to hook up a battery, how to buy a battery and so we just began to do life with them in 2002. We were later, under God's plan, appointed as missionaries. We served 3 years formally, vocationally with refugees. You had to fast forward. We thought we were going overseas, and long story, God had different plans with just some different help and other things that happened. But at that time, I didn't know, as we were mobilizing churches in the Kentuckiana area and the Ohio Valley to work with refugees. One of the guys working with Bosnians was named Trent DeLoach. So that was in 05, 06. You fast forward 15 years later, after I helped under a lot of political excitement to launch South Carolina's second refugee resettlement agency. And the Lord opened the door for us to come and serve with Trent DeLoach, who is our lead pastor at Clark's International Bible Church. So we're 12 miles from downtown Atlanta in a community called Clarkston. If you come to Atlanta, it's right on the northeast perimeter between 85 and I-20, where this U.S. State Department tells us there's been more refugees resettled in our zip code than any zip code in the U.S. So it's a very diverse community. It's not like you can go to area in Chicago or New York where there's Chinatown or different specific people. If you go to an apartment complex in Clarkston, there may be a Syrian family. Now, everybody's probably going to be living next door to Afghan family, next to a Burmese Christian family, next to maybe a Congolese family that had fled the DRC that may be Catholic or nominal believers. So there's a lot of ethnic diversity, maybe a little more than you wanted to, but the Acts17 initiative really flows from a vision of what Paul's message there at Acts17 and God's word to us, that the God who made the world and everything in it, being the Lord of heaven, being Lord of heaven and earth, he does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needs anything, since he himself gives all mankind life and breath and everything. From one man, God made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the time set for them and the exact boundaries where they should live. God did so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him. So a lot of our heart is what we do at Acts17 Initiative, in short, is a missions ministry and missions mobilization ministry of a local church, Clark's International Bible Church. So we often are going to help churches where they are, equip them to find their neighbors from the nations and engage them. But we're also a mission training center and a ministry center that is offering hospitality to our new neighbors. We call our welcoming ministry New Neighbor Care. So we want to help churches to be poised to welcome the foreigner, the stranger in their midst, with the love of Christ, both in word and deed. So,
hey, I didn't know your wife spoke Arabic. I had no idea.
She lost a lot of it in the upstate, Steve. Sorry. She would. Yeah, but yes, she did.
It's like my Mandarin.
She's Filipino and didn't grow up. She grew up in here and doesn't know Tagalog, but knew Arabic. So
I'll be looking for people, to lead a team to an Arabic-speaking place, to work with some Syrian refugees. So
yes.
Just plugging that out there for you and your wife. So you gave a good overview of Acts17 Initiative, what's happening in the U.S., your background. So expand that a little bit bigger to the world. the 82 plus
Yeah.
million displaced peoples globally. And
Yeah.
that doesn't even count the Afghan situation
That's right.
and what's happened since 2020. So just give us a bigger picture of what's going
Sure.
on around the world.
Yeah. Yeah, you hit those numbers. You know, we rely on the United Nations High Commission of Refugees, does an annual report in June, and so every June those numbers come out for last year. And so yeah, it's over 82 million forcefully displaced people, which that's a result of internal in their country, their persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, religious conflict, a lot of things. And with those forced displaced, it also is some natural disaster things happening. But out of those 82 million, you've got over 26 million that are refugees. So it means they're forced to flee, and it's not for natural disaster or anything else, but one of these with the legal immigration, there's 5 cases of persecution or well-founded fear of persecution. And so yeah, we would say we rely on the UN's numbers, and certainly those numbers are pretty low to what the global reality is now, what's happened in Afghanistan since, July and August. So it's hard to know. I mean, you can Google things and everybody's got a take, but the reality is there's a lot of people have been forced to flee their home, and Afghanistan, rightfully so, has got a lot of the focus the last couple of months, but certainly since the Arab Spring some 10 years ago and what's been happening in Syria in recent years. I mean, when I started dealing with refugees, in 2002, it was just a trickle in terms of what was being forced. You can look at the numbers, on the Global Migration Center, what was being forced to flee displaced. And though in the U.S., we've regularly welcomed average 70 to 75,000 refugees that were resettled annually every year. And those numbers have had, not getting political, but have been in a big decline the last 4 years. But while we've been able to help newly arriving refugees come in a trickle the last few years, the number of forcibly displaced people and refugees globally has gone up exponentially. So some of these global diaspora crossroads, these Istanbul and all over, Asia and Cairo and Nairobi and these places. The sad part is 86% of these displaced people are hosted in developing countries, and so so they don't have the infrastructure, the resources to really serve these peoples. So it's just a tragedy on top of tragedy. I mean, look at what's happening. Nearly 4 million of these refugees are hosted in Turkey alone. And those numbers, again, are before the Afghan crisis ramped up, in the last 3 or 4 months. And so when we talk about we only helped just over 11,000 refugees this last year, just over 11,000 in the U.S. that we welcomed the year before that were resettled. It's pretty small when you start talking about these millions. So really, I'm so grateful for. I mean, there's different organizations serving refugees abroad, but I think a lot of the vision, like what Steve and they're doing at Silk Road Catalyst, it's key to equip local churches, indigenous leaders on the ground that can serve these needs, because just always trying to saddle up a Western missionary and go do it just isn't realistic, and never more so than now with the pandemic when travel has been halted. And so the need to equip churches, believers in developing countries and how to serve people, how to minister to them when you've got $0 of a ministry budget is never more critical than now. But I mean, the global numbers of some of those, they tell us nearly 1 in 6 people are being displaced globally. And there's a lot that goes into that politically with what's happening in Venezuelans being forced out and these asylum seekers and internally displaced people. But the reality is these are people created in God's image that need to hear the love of Christ. Often, historically, we don't have the best numbers the last couple of years, but historically, 42% of refugees that have been resettled in the U.S. have been professing Christians. Now, we're not saying they're all born again. They just check the box, but they have professed to be a Christian. They could be Catholic. They may not be Protestant or evangelical. But the reality is a lot of these are brothers and sisters in Christ that were forced to flee, like in Myanmar and other places because of their faith. And so there's a lot of global crossroads. Malaysia, and Steve could help throw out some of these cities that it's vital for us to equip churches there and to help us get the gospel there, not just in word, but in deed. But yeah, we're the amount of forcefully displaced people is nothing like we've experienced in recorded written history, either in terms of the overall numbers or just proportionally. And so, yeah, it's a Kairos moment for the church, both for American believers to welcome refugees and take the gospel to their neighbors from the nations here, but to help in whatever way partner to get it abroad. And I think, 20 years ago, and Steve could attest to this, maybe we did a lot of good equipping for evangelism and disciple making, but probably not so much with good mercy ministry and how to come alongside. But it's hard to equip missionaries and church planners now if you don't have some kind of realistic community development component or be prepared for not when a disaster, not when a disaster's coming, but what is it, and how are we going to equip the church to be the first men and women on the scene to be the salt and light. So yeah, it's. Steve could probably do a whole show and just some things they've done, or you guys have on some things happening globally. But the needs are just, those of us that have traveled 15, 20 years. It's crazy in a sad, tragic kind of way. The displaced people. So.
Wow.
Jason, I just want to add something real quick before Mike. I know he's got a question he wants to ask. No, you were talking about just the number of people. So, when you think of Samaritan Purse and large organizations like that, World Relief, and you see that they're touching a lot of lives because of the expanse of how far they can reach in terms of numbers. But even recently we had a team go somewhere and met some Afghans, and we learned that nobody had gone to them. So the reality is, despite these large organizations, there are so many communities of refugees, whether it be Afghans, Syrians, or, whether from Southeast Asia, no one's getting to them yet. And so there are a ton of opportunities for people to get involved. But even with this, in terms of, our staff member being national and getting to them, it still took Westerners to get behind them so they could do the work they were doing in terms of delivering, a large amount of aid, water, even wheelchairs to those who were injured during the Afghan war. It's really just all comes together when everyone's got a role to play. So there's always going to be places, I just want to say that so people know that it doesn't take long to look and find a place where no one's touched yet, where they need hands and feet to engage. So, yeah. So Mike, I know you have a question for us or for Jason.
No, that's good. That's good. Actually, it brings up a couple. Jason, move forward with the opportunity gets away from us, because you had mentioned, about churches just really being kind of having their eyes open about what's happening. And I guess I'm wondering, as we get into what exactly is happening, for these refugees that are coming to the United States, do you guys have or what is the best way of, so I'm in Denver. Metro area. Is there a database to figure out who is coming to Denver in terms of refugees, or what is actually, because I quite frankly don't know. I'm sure they're coming here, but I don't really know where to start or where to look or any of that.
About 90% of the states, I know there's 50 states, but the traditional refugee resettlement lines. So in Colorado, for instance, and I know that I've got some think we've talked before, Mike, some relatives there, and was just, every state looks different. Every region looks different, but there's 4 refugee resettlement agencies in Colorado. And we're putting together, we don't do the best. So sometimes we intentionally don't do a lot of social media engagement because we're working with a lot of unreached people groups, and we don't want to take advantage of some of our Afghan friends. And so you won't see a lot in our social media kind of circles, but we're trying to put in an Afghan refugee welcome resource kit. So,
great.
If you go to our website, you just email me. It's Psalm, like the Bible, psalm963@gmail.com. We're putting together that we're trying to have ready by December 1st. It's going to help because church is going to be ready to step in, because the last 4 years, refugee resettlement agencies have had to dwindle in terms of staffing and funding because of what's happened with the previous administration. But with the Afghans being resettled, we can get more in the weeds of it. 90% of the times, it's one of the traditional refugee resettlement agencies in your state, in your large city. So in Colorado, I think there's just one organization in Colorado Springs, but 3 in Denver that are serving. They're serving those, and they often have a local name, and I can't remember Colorado, like Rocky Mountain Refugee Services, but they're connected to a larger organization like Lutheran Refugee Services, and they're not directly with the Lutheran Church. They're a spinoff. And I could there's faith-based groups, and there's some that aren't faith-based, and there's some that if you have a conversation with me or some of our support team that are pretty anti-faith, and so you got to walk a thin line with them, but they still need us to help. If they want to reach out and get a resource, there's you can go to the State Department's website. It's a little cumbersome if you're not familiar with it, but they haven't updated. They haven't done a lot of updates with the Afghan response. There's a couple of things, but what I found, they just did a Xerox copy and changed the heading from refugee resettlement to Afghan placement assistance. What's happening now with Afghans is they started a new program in response to the Afghan crisis called the Afghan Placement Assistance Program. You call it APA. Most people call it for short, not the writing style when you're in college or grad school, but the APA is the Afghan Placement Assistance. That's how most of the Afghans are being resettled right now. So that's different. They're still refugees. They need, but it's different than the traditional refugee resettlement. And that's important because as you're hearing this, we're just getting news here that, the present administration has halted refugee resettlement, welcoming refugees and being resettled through the State Department and refugee resettlement agencies here, and leading into Thanksgiving, where they'll put a halt on that till mid-January because they're just focusing on Afghans. I just talked this morning to a guy that partners with all 4 of our refugee resettlement agencies, and we're approaching 700 Afghans that have come to just Atlanta in the last 2.5 months. So we've almost all the refugees we had come total or 2 years we've had come to just our city in 2.5 months. So it does get confusing, but when we talk about the refugee numbers, all the Afghans come in generally under a different program called the Afghan Placement Assistance. And one of the challenges is that the majority of those aren't going to be English speakers. Traditional Afghan refugees in the U.S. came as what's called SIV, Special Immigrant Visas, where they spoke English because they were English translators or interpreters for our military branches or military contractors, and most of them spoke better English than me. And so now when they're being resettled, you do have that language barrier. Fortunately, there's been enough Afghans over the years resettled in this SIV program. You should be able to find some help with translation, but often we just had a family of 11 come late last night, Afghan family, and no English speakers. So Google Translate app is a huge help in these
it's gotten quite
these
good.
times. So
but Jason, just as you were talking, so I just went ahead and pulled up Google and just put in refugee resettlement Denver.
Yeah.
And a number of agencies came up, and you were all right. One of them is one that has Lutheran in the name.
Right.
Right. So at least that gives, people interested kind of a first step, but in terms of what to do.
And I would add churches and believers watching this in the U.S. and hearing it.
Mm-hmm.
If you get a voicemail, if you don't get a call back, you got to be diligent. I mean, just
you got to be on it,
because they're so overwhelmed, and now a lot of the response from the audience has waned because it isn't just overwhelming the headlines like it was in August, right? The Afghan crisis, but there still is some huge needs, and by God's grace, because there was so few in our city, at least so few refugees that arrived the last couple of years, there was a lot of furniture and storage and clothing and some things to meet those immediate needs because so few refugees had come. But now that stockpiles dwindled down. So,
So in terms of, when a refugee comes to the United States in particular, particularly what you said about like the ones from Afghanistan may not even have any or much English. So what are they doing when they get here? Is there programs to help them find jobs? Gosh, if they don't speak English, it might be hard to find a job. But what are they doing, and kind of where are they going kind of once they get here?
Well, they're so with that Afghan placement assistant program, it is utilizing a lot of the traditional programs and social service offerings to refugees that were replaced. The big challenge is an overwhelming number. I mean, there's been over 50,000, at some of the military bases where they've been hosting these Afghan, really asylum seekers is a better name, under what they're calling the Operation Allies Welcome. So when they get here, there's a few things that happen. Sometimes they've been through some steps at a military base. They've got to go through medical protocols from not just COVID, being clear of that, but not having tuberculosis and some other things before they could ever be resettled somewhere. But within the first 30 days, kids got to be enrolled in school. Within the first 10 days, they've got to be enrolled in ESL. Doesn't mean they're actively in ESL classes, but they're enrolled in ESL. That's part of how they will keep getting services. They've got to be enrolled in what's called employment services. And one of the biggest challenges, those you watching things economically in the U.S. and have probably seen a labor shortage. You've probably had restaurants closed during the pandemic that hadn't reopened with the labor shortage. The biggest challenge with helping our refugee friends is not so much get employment, is they're chronically underemployed, right? You come with a family and you got 4 or 5 kids. It's hard to support a family like that and work in a chicken processing plant very long. So that's one of the big jobs, at least in the Southeast, that refugees may get. So there's other, if you were in Atlanta, there's we host an employment service group here on our campus and our goal is to be able to have every social service need that could be met by a newly arriving refugee. We want every square inch of our campus used for that when we're not in active worship on Sundays. And so we have a group called Amplio that serves with employment services. So they help them.
Oh, great.
They help them, sometimes, there was just a dentist from Afghanistan. He was at our fall festival, came in on October 29th, I think. He's like, oh, I'd love to practice dentistry. And the reality is that's not going to happen quickly or easily or without years of other training and certification in the U.S. And so that's a sad reality. That's why a lot of people think, well, why are they resettling here? A lot of folks, they didn't want to leave, and they did have good lives. They were all poor and destitute, but they didn't have a choice. So trying to help them go from surviving to thriving is where churches can really step in and almost just offering like foster care for refugees, like you're helping them do life, and to not be homeless, but to thrive. And certainly you're telling them you do this along the way because Jesus commands us to, and Jesus loves them. But so there is social service provision. There's health care.
Great.
For a limited time, and that's why they get them in employment services and all these things, because they've got to be self-sustaining.
Right.
But yeah, just being a friend to them. You don't have to be a social service expert. You may not have ever filled out. Kind of Medicaid, Medicare, refugee care, health care is similar, but someone that just speaks and understands English that can help them maneuver, because most of these people, they aren't going to drive, and even trying to get social services at these offices while you're navigating public transit is quite challenging. So really, just people trying to be their friend,
That's great.
And figuring it out as you go. It's going to look different with each family.
That's great. So I know Steve has our final question, but before we do that, Jason, let me because when you were with us last time, one of the things that was most impactful to me was just what you said about, when a refugee does come to the United States, these are highly vetted people, right? Because I think back then, one of the concerns was these people coming from the Middle East, and are these going to be, terrorists, that we're bringing in or whatever? But I'm assuming it's still the case. I mean, these are some of the most highly vetted people around, aren't they? Is that still the case?
Yes, absolutely. Through the traditional refugee resettlement placement program, they'll never get on a plane to the U.S. until they've went through quite security and vetting protocol, medical checks, and so they can be they can be denied that when they're in that process. Now with the Afghan placement assistance, they're bringing them to military bases, so that's not the ideal interim place. But when you're thinking of security and vetting and protection, you can be assured it's getting done, by guys carrying heavily armed weapons. So it's happening. They go through, the amount of protocols they're going through are pretty, they're major. And so we've had Congolese coming up to our southern border for years seeking asylum, and our being the U.S., our immigration law is that you can come to any port of entry and present yourself seeking in need of asylum, and legally the U.S., we hear your case. It may take years, and that's true at the southern border, or if we're bringing them here through the asylum process with these Afghans. And so it is, a lot of these are going to be tied up in legal proceedings to get long-term status, but security and vetting is definitely done. So
that's great.
Yeah, I'll just add something to that. So the group I'm connected to, that's helping Afghans escape. So those that are being brought to the U.S. through, and it's not direct. There is no direct link from Afghanistan to the U.S. or even if they cross into Pakistan to the U.S. It's a web of, you go here to here to here, and eventually you end up in the U.S. If you go through the whole process. But even those who make it, those I'm connected to, you have to have a sponsor in the U.S., an American citizen who is vetted and verified. And in the case of our neighbor, him being in the U.S. military, serving in Afghanistan, they have to know the Afghans coming. It's just not saying, hey, I'll be a sponsor for any Afghan. You actually have to know them personally. You have to be able to prove that you know them personally before they'll go through the whole process of getting them here. So it's different from, as you were talking about, the traditional refugee vetting, but it's still pretty stringent in terms of, like you're saying, they're making it up as they go, but they're kind of put themselves in that situation, but we've got to help them.
Yeah.
So, it's not fair that we just dump them and say, you're on your own now. Anyways.
Yeah. And I would add to that, Steve. I mean, I remember the first special immigrant visa Afghan that we welcomed to South Carolina. And the person connected to him had been in the military for years, and he lived in rural South Carolina. So I had to check him out to make sure it was legit. Why is this Afghan going to move to outside of Clemson, South Carolina? And when I called the guy and told him his name, do you know this guy? He said, yes. I said, would you help him if we resettle him? He just started weeping. And he said that this guy saved my life as an interpreter. He said, I could give you the name of a dozen other guys across the country that served with me in the Army that helped him. And so a lot of our military folks are quick to say, man, we've got to help these people. They helped us, and many of them saved our lives. Regardless of what you feel about what happened in Afghanistan and the war and battle and all that, our men and women in arms did serve alongside of them, and a lot of them it could cost their life if we don't help them. So yeah, there are opened up sponsorship opportunities, which can be tricky as well, but one of the biggest needs is a housing shortage for large families, and so it's good to see that Americans are able to help that. But it is another layer of administration for that program that's got to happen. So it's yeah.
So we actually need to wrap this up and come to a close, but we want to ask one question, because this is really to help the listener. Is what ways can they pray? What ways can they be involved? So if you could give a few bullet points of how they can be involved and how they can help the Afghans, even if they don't know any, just to help them, or just refugees in general.
Yeah, sure. Well, I don't want to be glib but certainly prayer. I mean, we want to be in prayer for what's happening and praying for the opportunities. As I said, folks could reach out to us, and we're trying to do this kind of Afghan response resource kit to try to help them. At least we'll provide a process and a path, whether they're in Colorado or others, that may point them to some resources. But being very proactive and diligent if they want to be boots on the ground helping Afghans or other refugees, trying to really reach out to the local refugee resettlement agencies, and that's the process these Afghans are being placed and serviced. And quickly their caseworkers are overwhelmed with the amount of people they're serving, so they'd welcome volunteers. Try to be an advocate for them. Most cities have got huge needs with winter coming, so doing a coat drive, I see on social media a lot of the deadlines just passing now for the Samaritans shoe boxes. So this could be a great Christmas outreach for your church, a coat drive, winter clothing. Mostly you're going to find in our cities a shortage of all men's clothing, but winter clothing for both genders and all ages is pretty uniform across the country. So that's a quick, tangible thing. You may not get to meet or welcome an Afghan, but certainly help giving them a coat is I think, what Jesus tells us in Matthew 25, welcoming with a cup of water. So,
yeah, thanks for that, Jason. There's a lot of opportunity, and it does sound like a lot of good outreach opportunities.
Yeah,
for our churches. So, Jason, as we close, first of all, thank you so much for coming. Sure appreciate you and your heart for refugees. If folks want to get in touch with you, you'd mentioned your email.
Yeah.
Is there any other? I think I see in the banner behind you some.
Our
website.
Our website,
and some. Yeah. What are the best ways for
Acts17
people?
Initiative resettlement.org, the whole thing, and you can, I mean, there's a click if you want more information, but it all funnels to that Psalm 963 Gmail normally.
Okay.
Psalm 963, which stands for Psalm 963, Psalm 963 at gmail.com. So PSALM 963 at gmail.com.
Well, sure sounds like with the need, that's understandable. You guys are busy, so well, great. Well,
yeah, it's a good busy, thank the Lord. So
yeah, it is. It's good to be busy, doing that kind of work, and so well, good. Well, Jason, thank you so much. I would just encourage folks watching to get in touch with Jason. Do that Google search for those refugee resettlement. Again, even as we were just here, I just did that and found 3 or 4 agencies here where I live, and so seems like, Jason, they're already coming. It's not like you got to go find
that's
them.
right.
It's a pretty pretty easy thing to begin for churches to get involved in. So thank
Absolutely.
you for
alerting
us.
I know we're out of time, but I would add to that, Mike, even outside of refugee resettlement agencies, we've had 3 families in the last 2 weeks that were resettled in another city and heard about a friend, a cousin, and ended up here in Atlanta. So you're going to have a lot of secondary migration. So there's just a lot of opportunity. You just got to be intentional and look for them.
Oh, okay. So maybe family comes and they already have maybe relatives that are in the U.S. and say, oh, we want to be with our
That's
our
right.
family members in Atlanta. So great. Well, good. So Jason, thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for watching, and we're sure appreciative of you. If you want to get in touch with Steve or I, of course, on our Facebook page, facebook.com/missions talk is a good way. We're always looking for show ideas. If there's something you're interested in having us, talk about on the show, we'd sure love to hear from you. And we're sure looking forward to having you with us on the next episode of Missions Talk.